Rev up your engines! Today I'm going to show you things you can do yourself to make sure that your air conditioning is going to work this summer season correctly. So I'll explain all about how an air conditioning system works first. Air conditioning is just a heat pump. It sucks the hot air out of the cabin of your car, and then it blows that heat using the AC condenser in front of your car's radiator. The condenser is hidden in here in the front, and behind it is the radiator and the cooling fans that cool both the radiator and the air conditioning system. Now in modern cars, of course, it's all computer controlled, but it's still the same basic idea. The refrigerant is compressed by the compressor here. It's cool that a car thing's always, the name means what they actually do. And once the refrigerant is compressed, it goes through the lines into the condenser in the front, where the heat is sucked away by the cooling fans in the radiator system. Then the high pressure refrigerant goes on the skinny little line into the evaporator inside the car. Here's an evaporator. When the high pressure gets into the evaporator, it expands, and as it does, it sucks in the heat from inside your car where you're hot. Now this big tube here, it's connected to the evaporator inside the vehicle, and it takes the refrigerant out and sucks it back into the compressor down here, and the compressor in an endless cycle then compresses it again. It goes through the condenser where it gives off a lot of heat, and then goes back into the evaporator. So it's basically an endless cycle of compressing refrigerant, then heat gets sucked out in the front of the car, then that refrigerant goes inside the dash where it expands in the evaporator and it sucks the heat out of the car, then it compresses that again and goes back to the condenser, which gets rid of the heat. It just keeps sucking heat out of the car. Now when made correctly, they're very reliable systems, but there are things that you need to check before summer gets hot and it doesn't work. And the first thing is, make sure your cooling fans on your radiator are both working fine, because if they don't suck all that air through there, the engine can overheat, the pressure can get too high in the compressor system. You're going to make sure both fans work, so test them like this. Turn the AC on full blast and let it run a few minutes. You want to make sure that both of those cooling fans are coming on and off. They won't stay on the whole time, but you want to make sure they both work and blow good. You can see this one's blowing good, and over here, this one's blowing good too. And I've had many customers over the years say, my AC doesn't seem to be blowing cold enough. And I checked, and what was happening was, maybe one of the fans was blowing, but the other one wasn't. So it didn't get enough airflow. You got to make sure that they're both working fine and blowing a lot of air when it gets hot outside. Now the next thing to check is the cabin air filter. Believe it or not, many modern cars inside the glove box have a filter for the AC system. You just have to fiddle with the glove box. This one's plastic, so it's real easy. Out it comes, and inside this little panel, you take it off. Voila, there's a filter. And this car is parked under a tree, so I got one of these reusable ones. You can see there's a lot of crud coming out of it. You can hose it down and clean it out and use it over many times. And you wouldn't believe how many times I'd have a customer come to me and say, oh, my AC is really working poorly. And what happened was, this thing had been on there for 3 or 4 years. It had never been touched. It was full of crud, and hardly any air was getting sucked over the evaporator. So check your cabin air filter if you have one. And if you're like me and park under a tree, clean it all the time. And when you're done, the cover just snaps right over and you snap the glove box back in. And this is one of the few times I like plastic, because you can just bend it by your hand and snap it back in place. You don't need a bunch of tools to take the stupid thing apart with. Now the next thing to check, as nutty as it sounds, is the car's battery. And here's why. Now this Lexus may be 17 years old, but everything's computer controlled, even on the AC system. So if you don't have the correct voltage coming in from the battery, you're doing really strange things and not blowing really cold air. You want to have your battery load tested just to make sure it's still good. Takes less than a minute to hook it up and run the test. In this case, it says replace battery because it's too weak. And it makes total sense, because my wife said, gee, the AC doesn't seem to be blowing as cold as it used to. Well, it wasn't getting enough power. I'll just change the battery. Now, all cars lose a little bit of refrigerant as time goes on because they have a compressor that has a shaft and there's a rubber seal. The rubber seal has to leak a little so that the oil inside can lubricate the seal. If the seal ran dry, it would burn out really fast. So they all leak a little bit, but they all eventually run out. A professional uses gauges to see if it needs more refrigerant, but here's a good check. If you find that the passenger side is getting reasonably cool, but you go over to the driver's side and it's not as cold, that often means you're low on refrigerant. Because in this case, the evaporator's inside here. So this side gets to the evaporator first. So the coolest air will come out here, and then when it gets to the other side, it won't be quite as cool. So the air blowing over here won't be as cold as it is on the passenger side. That's often a sign that you need refrigerant added to your system. Now, if you have a set of AC gauges and how to use them, go ahead and add your own refrigerant. But please, don't go buy one of those little cans at the store and start adding it on a guess, because modern systems, they can be off even half an ounce, and they're going to have problems if you put too little or too much. You can destroy a system. So don't just willy-nilly decide, oh, I'm going to try to put some refrigerant in. You can do some serious damage that way. And really, if you want to mess around with this stuff yourself, heck, you can get a set of decent gauges for 50, 60 bucks. Now, the last thing you can check is the condenser itself. Now, this is really handy because on this matrix, the condenser's open. As soon as you open the hood, there it is. If it gets covered in bugs, you can clean it off with a little water, hydrate them, and then squirt them off, and then you're going to have a much more efficient condenser. And heck, since the condenser is in front of the radiator, it's the first thing in a car to get bugs and mud and crud. And sometimes I've seen plastic bags stuck in them. Most cars aren't open like this when you open the hood. Many of them are hidden behind grills and stuff, and you can't see in that well. So get a flashlight, look around. If you see an old garbage bag stuck in there or a bunch of bugs, get it out of the way, because if you lower that airflow, your AC goes whoop, the pressures go too high and it's not going to work right. Now, of course, if you can find a leak in an AC system, it's obvious, you can hear it hissing or dye comes out. My advice is, first, attempt to fix it mechanically. The other day I had a Ford in here. It needed an evaporator. It was going to be over $2,000 to replace that evaporator. So the customer said, gee, is there something else we can do? It's hot and humid here in Houston. I said, well, there's sealers out there, and I found one that works as best as any I could ever try out. So I said, well, for like about 30 bucks, we can try this stuff. It's called AC Pro Super Seal. The company is honest. Look what it says on the can. For use in car AC systems that can hold a charge for at least 2 weeks and have a working compressor. And from my years of trying different sealers on people's cars, this is the only one that I'll try anymore, because they're being honest. A lot of them say, oh, we'll fix any leak in your AC, blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, if you put it in and it hisses right out, that hole's too big, it isn't gonna fix it. To give an example of another leaking system, but one that has less pressure, let's say you get a hole in your tire. Some people use that Fix-A-Flat. Now, if you had a nail or a tiny hole, the stuff actually can seal the leak. Sealers can work for small leaks, not big ones. Now, my advice is, before you use any of the sealers, make sure the compressor is working and isn't making horrible noises. If you turn it on, it's going clacka, clacka, clacka. The compressor's shot and you're gonna have to replace it. Then start up the car and turn the AC on, full blast, then go under the hood. Make sure that the cooling fans are working. This one has one here and one here. They're blowing perfectly fine. Look at the compressor. This one's quiet. It's not making any weird noises. Now, in the case of this Acura, it's leaking it out after a month and a half. So, it's a small leak. And when I checked it for leaks with my sniffer, lo and behold, it was leaking inside the dash. And I know a lot of mechanics are going to say, oh, don't ever use that stuff, it'll clog your system, I lie. But look, they give true directions here. It says, will not clog up AC system or service port when used as directed. So you do exactly as they say. This isn't a miracle in a can that's going to fix other problems. It will only fix small leaks. And to give it the best chance of working, here's what I do. If you don't have the equipment, pay a mechanic to do it for you, because you really have to do it this way if you want it to have the best chance of sealing any small leak in your AC. First, you have to hook up a set of gauges. Put it on the low side. Then you have to evacuate the system to get anything out. And in most places by law, you have to have a recycling machine. If there is refrigerant left in the system, you got to hook this up to a recycling machine so you don't send the refrigerant into the atmosphere. But of course, if it's completely empty, then you can just hook this up to a vacuum pump and just suck it out to get everything out so there's a complete vacuum in the system. Now, this is a really important step in putting in any sealer. To do it correctly, you got to empty the system out. Then you put the sealer in, which is easy enough. Can's got a little clip that goes right on. You just take this line off, and put this on. Then you just turn the can upside down and spray it in, pushing the button. And of course you do this with the engine running and the AC on. And once the can's empty, and you can tell that by listening, put your ear on the can, and when it starts hearing a sucking sound, you know it's hollow and dry inside. And then once the can is in, you fill it up with a full load of refrigerant. And it's very important that as soon as the can's empty, you fill it up with refrigerant. You want it flowing through the system. Then my advice is, let it sit and idle with all the fans running for about half an hour. That way it flows through the system and has the best chance of sealing it. Now I know a lot of mechanics are going to go berserk and say, oh, don't ever use that stuff, it'll destroy this or that. Well, the system has to have a slow leak. It does have to leak out in 2 weeks or longer. If you got to fill it up every hour or after a day or two, this stuff's not going to work. The leak would be too big. We're talking about a small leak here. And as I said, it's not a miracle in a can. It's not going to fix a broken AC system that's got some other problem like a expansion valve or a compressor or the fans aren't working right. It's only going to fix small leaks. Now over the years, I've tried lots of different ones. And unfortunately, luckily they were old junky cars that the customer said, well, we'll give it a try because we're not going to put much money into the car. Some of the other ones actually did clog up systems and the compressors locked up. But this AC Pro one, it's the only one that I will try anymore. But you do have to go through all these steps that I've shown. You can't just think, oh, I'll just shoot this stuff in and drive around and see if it helps. And as I said, if your system makes horrible noises when it's running, don't even try this stuff. That means that at a minimum, the compressor's starting to wear out. You need some serious work, and this little $29 can is not going to fix your problem. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.